Today, we work in over 50 crisis-affected countries, bringing ingenuity, fortitude, and optimism to making a lasting impact for the people we serve.
When you read the emergency watch list, you'll see that when governments can't meet citizens' needs, armed groups can form, and how this triggers new conflicts and intensifies old ones.
We're living in a flammable world. More people fleeing from conflict than at any time since records began. More civil wars counted now, more than 50 civil wars going on at the moment. And this is both literally a flammable world, wildfires, but metaphorically it's a flammable world.
Good afternoon and welcome to Washington Post Live in another installment of our series World Stage. I'm Jonathan Capehart, Associate Editor at the Washington Post. Just 90 minutes ago, the International Rescue Committee released its new IRC emergency watch list of nations at greatest risk of humanitarian crisis in 2025. Joining me now to discuss it and how the international community should address these crises is the President and CEO of the International Rescue Committee, David Miliband. David, welcome back to Washington Post Live.
Hey, Jonathan, very good to be with you. Thanks for having me on.
So before we dive into your new report, let me have you put your hat on as a former UK Foreign Secretary to get your assessment of the evolving situation in Syria. What does the toppling of Bashar al-Assad mean for the humanitarian situation there and for the country's future?
Well, I think it's very relevant to the conversation we're going to have today because the situation in Syria has been both a political emergency and a humanitarian emergency since the civil war started in 2011. The International Rescue Committee currently has 850 people working on the ground in Syria, about 450 in the northwest of the country, 400 in the northeast. And we have not taken Syria off our emergency watch list in the last few years. I know a lot of commentators have said over the last 4 or 5 years, the war's over, President Assad has won. That obviously has turned out not to be true. And we always believed that the scale of humanitarian crisis, the fact that there were 7 million refugees outside the country, the fact that 16 million people inside Syria were in humanitarian need, that this was an accident waiting to happen, really. And it has now happened. Obviously, there are significant geopolitical implications, weakening of Iran, strengthening of Turkey, etc. But there's also the humanitarian end of this, and the absolute priorities now are about getting the aid flows through all the border crossings, making sure that hyperinflation doesn't cripple the country, sustaining the health system, and organizing orderly return for those Syrian refugees, 3 million in Turkey, 1 million in Lebanon, who want to go back. All of that obviously dependent on the formation of an inclusive government that respects Syria's diversity.
Well, let's pick up on the 7 million refugees outside the country that you were talking about. Britain, Germany, which the Washington Post reports has absorbed the highest number of Syrian asylum seekers in Europe. And several other European countries announced on Monday they are suspending decisions on asylum claims by Syrian nationals. Is this initial response an appropriate response from the West to what is happening in Syria?
Yeah, just to put it in context, there are about 780,000 refugees in Germany, only about 17 to 20,000 in the UK, as I said, 1 million in Lebanon. Obviously, the decisions on asylum status, on refugee status, depend on an assessment of what's going on inside a country. In this case, no one quite knows where Syria is going to be in a month or 6 months. So you can understand why it's practically very difficult to make an asylum determination. The situation inside the country is one where there's genuine, I wouldn't say optimism, but there's reasons, there's grounds for hope. The flame of hope has been lit among Syrians inside the country and outside. Many are returning, some are leaving. It's important to say there's a lot of different decisions being made by different Syrians. But at the moment, you can understand why it's not yet clear whether or not it's going to be safe for people to go home. What we know is two things. One, until now, the refugees who are outside Syria have not wanted to go back because they feared, for example, if they were young men, they feared being dragooned into Assad's army. The second thing is there's suddenly a surge. If you talk to any Syrian now, they'll tell you, for the first time, I believe I might get my country back. And so that's the balance that has to be struck. The main players are not in Europe or even in the US at the moment. The main players are local and regional, but you can see why there's a moment of uncertainty.
Let me follow up, because some European leaders have even gone so far as to pressure Syrians to leave their countries. I'm just wondering, how do you think this reflects the mood in Europe when it comes to immigrants, refugees, and asylum seekers?
Well, you'll know that from here. I mean, the mood's pretty negative. I mean, that's the obvious thing that it reflects. Now, I think it's very, very important that we uphold the principle that no one gets sent back to somewhere that's not safe, and that returns by refugees are done on the basis that they choose to do so. I think that's very, very important. Obviously, Syria's status, its safety is going to develop. There are hopes that it will recognize the diversity of the country. Remember, 5% of Syria's population, the population was about 23, 24 million before the war started, the civil war started in 2011. There's about 5% are Christians. There are different Muslim denominations, confessional groups within Syria. We've been working under what is now the government of Syria. The new prime minister was in charge of the northwest of the country, where we've been working for the last 12 years. He, in his dealings with a range of international NGOs, he allowed us to do our work without interference. We were not subjected to politicization. And so one's got to hope that the words that are being used at the moment about all Syrians having a future in Syria turn into actions.
One more before we turn to the IRC report, David, I promise. How do you expect British Prime Minister Keir Starmer, a fellow member of the Labour Party, to manage Donald Trump and his America First policy? Any advice for the Prime Minister?
Well, there are two questions there. One, the second of which is for me to advise him, and I think I'll probably be diplomatically evasive about that. I think
like
that
a good foreign secretary.
But what Americans should know, about Keir Starmer is that he's a very methodical person. He's someone of real character and clarity in the way that he approaches international issues. And I think above all, his word is his bond. And he's said absolutely clearly that he wants to work with any administration that's elected in the United States. He's met President Trump, I think, on 2 occasions, spoken to him. Obviously, American elections are dispositive not just for the future of America, they have outsized impact around the world. And I think that it's very, very important. You referred to the Western countries. I think it's very, very important at this time of global tumult that those countries that are committed to fundamental notions of human rights, of the rule of law, are able to stick together.
All right, let's talk about that IRC's emergency watch list for 2025. What are some of the big takeaways from this year's report that folks should know about?
I'd highlight a couple of things, really. First of all, humanitarian need now consumes about 300 million people in the world, and more than 80% of those people are concentrated in just 20 countries. So the countries that we've identified here, basis of 75 different indicators, qualitative and quantitative. It's a rigorous scientific exercise, this, that helps us with our internal planning for the humanitarian needs of 2025, but also allows us to sound the alarm about places that are too often forgotten. Sudan is top of the list, 30 million people in humanitarian need. So I want people to understand the concentration of need in these 20 countries. Also, the protracted nature of conflict. 14 of the 20 countries were there a decade ago, countries like Syria. So that's the first thing. Secondly, the report's very strong theme is that the world is out of balance. It's out of balance between hard and soft power. It's out of balance between people and planet. It's out of balance between civilians and soldiers, because civilians are bearing the brunt of conflict around the world. There are 59 conflicts around the world. And it's out of balance between rich and poor, not just between global north and so-called global south, but also within the countries like Nigeria or even Syria. The gap between rich and poor is huge. And these imbalances, we argue, are man-made. And they're also not just a moral challenge, they're a strategic challenge, because everything we know about untreated humanitarian crisis is that it leads to political instability. And Syria, in a way, is a case study of that.
You mentioned Sudan being at the top of the list for the second consecutive year, I'll point out. What's driving the conflict there, and what does 2025 have in store for that East African nation?
Well, thank you for giving a bit of space to focus on this, because it is incredible if you think about it. 10% of the people in humanitarian need in the world live in Sudan, and it's a country of 45 million people. What's going on is that there's a brutal, grotesque conflict between two different factions, one the Sudan Armed Forces, the other the so-called Rapid Support Group. And the conflict is brutal for decisions that are being made by the commanders and soldiers on each side. It's costing huge numbers of lives. It's led to mass displacement. We've had to move our own office out of the capital. The capital, Khartoum, has been depopulated. But how are these people able to fight? They're able to fight because they're getting enormous support from backers in the international system. One of the things that's very striking about today's civil wars that we highlight in our emergency watch list is that civil conflict within a state, is increasingly sponsored by outside parties. And that's true in the Sudan case in spades. I mean, there's backing for both sides. That's why both sides think they can't lose. And at the moment, there's no light at the end of the tunnel for the people of Sudan. The political process is in balk. It's stuck. There isn't a strong UN presence because it's devolved its responsibilities to the African Union. And of course, the contagion doesn't stop within Sudan. I mean, all I need to say to you, Jonathan, is that people are fleeing to South Sudan. That is one of the poorest countries in the world. And you can see how desperate people are. And I met on the South Sudan border a couple with their two kids from Khartoum. She was a hairdresser. He was a shoemaker. The pride of their life was that their two kids were going to university in Khartoum, and all four of them are now living in South Sudan. That is the cost that's being borne by the neighboring states, because it's important to remember most refugees are in poor countries, not in rich countries.
Well, I'm glad you pointed out that where the refugee flow is going, because it made me wonder, isn't Sudan's northern border with Egypt?
Yeah, no, there
Egyptians?
are refugees in Egypt as well, and there are. Chad has more. So South Sudan, obviously, Central African Republic in the corner. Chad, probably 1 million refugees have gone into eastern Chad. Smaller number into Egypt. So it's and this part of Africa is very significant regionally. That's partly why there's so much international armed interest in there. And it's the refugee crisis is one symptom of the flow. I mean, it was said that in the Economist magazine about, sorry to mention them, I know it's Washington Post, but they're a weekly, so I suppose it's okay to mention them. But the Economist reported that 60% of the people in Calais trying to get to the UK were from Sudan. So you can see that this spreads out.
Another conflict to talk about, and that is the situation in Gaza, which ranks second. What is the humanitarian situation on the ground there? And are you at all optimistic that a ceasefire is possible or even imminent?
Yeah, I mean, the numbers are smaller, but the intensity is equal. 2 million people live in Gaza. Obviously, the war's been going on since October the 7th. Still 100 hostages, 120 hostages. But the needs of those 2 million people are enormous. We have teams on the ground who are doing emergency medical work, mobile health, child protection, also water and sanitation. And the fighting is obviously the primary cause of displacement and of suffering. But there are also grave restrictions on the flow of humanitarian aid, and there's been recently some looting of the small amounts of aid that are getting through. So all I can report is that the needs are very, very high indeed. I mean, overwhelmingly high, 90+% of the population in desperate need, especially in the north of Gaza, where, I don't know, 200,000 people are living, and it's effectively sealed off. Now, you asked about political processes. I mean, one of the things that we report in our watch list is how conflict is triumphing over diplomacy. The diplomacy is continuing, but it's obviously too many people have said that they were optimistic about a deal for too long. And so it would be wrong to say that. What I can say is that a deal is desperately needed, because protecting the civilians, getting aid to civilians, and getting the hostages out ultimately depends on a ceasefire. And that is our job as a humanitarian agency, is obviously to treat needs and to speak to the needs that exist. And I can't, in all honesty, say I'm optimistic about a ceasefire. Obviously, the Lebanon ceasefire has to hold, but it always seemed more likely to get a deal on Lebanon than it has on Gaza. And I think that the efforts that the Biden administration are making are desperately needed, even in its last 5 weeks.
Mm-hmm. Can you talk about the violence in the West Bank? What's it like for Palestinians living there right now?
Yeah, I think that's a very important point to mention, because obviously Gaza and West Bank together are second on our watch list. I mean, the West Bank violence has claimed 700 Palestinian lives and over 30 Israeli lives in the last year. The violence of settlers has been significant cause of that, and obviously the long-standing question of the future of Palestinians and of Palestinian aspirations for statehood are bound up with the situation on the West Bank, where the settlement issue is so present, so ever present. As a humanitarian agency, we're focused on the needs that exist, but it should concern people deeply that, as well as Gaza, West Bank is now described variously I mean, Gaza is described in apocalyptic terms. West Bank is described in very dangerous terms, volatile terms.
I'm looking for my notes from the intro video, because you said something that I wrote down that was very memorable. You said, we're living in a flammable world, and you were talking literally and metaphorically on fire. How does climate change factor into the IRC list, and how does it impact some of the issues we've been discussing?
Yeah, thanks for picking that up, Jonathan. I mean, it is amazing. 16 of the top 20 countries on the emergency watch list are both conflict states and in the top quartile of states for climate vulnerability. In other words, by the accident of geography, they're most exposed to the climate crisis. And I think it's worth remembering that while people talk about an average rise in global temperatures of 1.5 degrees, in the central Sahel region of Africa, it's already 50% greater than that. And of course, rises in average global temperature are associated with more extreme weather events. And essentially, the countries on the watch list are disproportionately subject to those extreme weather events, and they get a fraction of the money for climate resilience to help protect livelihoods, whether in agriculture or in urban areas. And so one of the things that we're arguing for as a humanitarian agency is that there needs to be a much better job done of aligning efforts to build effective humanitarian action with effective action for climate resilience. That means making our systems of aid much more anticipatory, not just reactive. It means supporting livelihoods, especially of rural communities. It means trying to take action much, much earlier. And so this climate conflict interface speaks to this idea of the literal and metaphorical flammable world. I mean, I don't want to take the idea too far, but the sprinklers aren't working and the fire service isn't there. So this flammable world is on fire in too many places, and the tinder comes from stress on resources, conflict exacerbated by the climate crisis.
What does the impending Trump presidency mean for the countries on the IRC list?
Well, I think that depends is the only answer that we can give. It's very important that we say, as a non-political organization, that we work with any administration, American or otherwise. It's evident that there are different strands within President Trump's coalition. Some, as you mentioned, emphasize at home and the home front. Others are very focused on competition with China, and certainly the Chinese presence in Africa, Asia, Latin America is growing, systematic, strategic. And there are still others who put a pin in American primacy and emphasizing that. So we've got to respect the different elements of that coalition. Our job is to put forward the evidence about what actually works in humanitarian aid. We're big reformers of the humanitarian aid system. We're big advocates for more cost effectiveness and cost efficiency of the humanitarian aid system. We're also big advocates of more innovation in the humanitarian aid system. So there are two sides of the equation, as you imply. One is about how does American foreign policy develop? How does it contribute to stability or not? And we can make our own arguments about that. The other side of the equation is how does humanitarian need get addressed? Because untended humanitarian need is such a source of political destabilization.
So, humanitarian aid is part of foreign aid. And Elon Musk, the world's richest person, who President-elect Trump has tapped to lead the new cost-cutting Department of Government Efficiency, agreed with former Congressman Ron Paul's suggestion that the United States should end foreign aid. Let's put aside the morality of a decision like that aside for a moment. Why is foreign aid a good investment for the United States?
Well, I would love to sit down with Elon Musk and talk to him about how foreign aid delivers value for money, how it can deliver more value for money, and how it's a strategic imperative, not just a moral imperative. The truth is that the case for foreign aid is that it works. It works in saving lives. It works in immunizing kids. It works in serving people to help achieve sustainable livelihoods for themselves. It works in treating disease, notably through efforts like the PEPFAR program that President Trump doubled down on in supporting in his first term. So the case for foreign aid is that it works. Our case is that it could work better. And that's something where I think there should be common cause, because we've run 400 cost effectiveness and cost efficiency studies over the last 10 years. We're very committed to the idea that foreign aid can work better. And I saw the tweet that you referred to. And because I'm from the UK and used to be in the UK government, I know that the figure that was in there for the UK aid, $750 million, is actually much lower than the actual numbers. So I'd want to make sure that the facts are there. A country like the UK, 0.5% of our national income goes on overseas aid. In the US, it's 0.17%. So although in absolute terms, America delivers a lot, we've got to beware of misinterpreting the data. But as I say, we're very committed to the idea that foreign aid is a strategic as well as moral imperative. And we think there's a very good case for how it works well and how it could work better.
David, as folks who know your story, they know that you are the son of refugees. How does your background inform your work at the IRC?
Well, that's interesting. I mean, my dad was a refugee from Belgium to the UK in 1940. My mum came as a 12-year-old girl in 1946, both Jewish refugees from Belgium and from Poland. And I suppose that in my early childhood, in my mid-20s, I was born in 1965. I know I look much older, but I was born in 1965, and my parents did something that I suppose many immigrant and refugee families did. They tried to give me the security that they never had, and I was lucky enough to see that. I also saw how they contributed to the country that they ended up in. They became incredibly proud of being British and what Britain had done for them. And I suppose it reminds me, or tells me every day, that we're all human. We may look different, but we're actually 99% the same. And I feel that very, very strongly in the work that we do all around the world. The International Rescue Committee was set up by Albert Einstein. in the 1930s. We were set up to serve people of all faiths and none, and that's what we do today. And it's our common humanity that binds us together.
David, you're only 2 years older than me, so you look fabulous. David Miliband, President and CEO of the International Rescue Committee, thank you very much for coming back to Washington Post Live.
Thanks a lot, Jonathan. Good to be with you.
And thank you for joining us. If you're not already a subscriber, you can sign up for our Washington Post subscription and get a free trial by visiting washingtonpost.com/live. You see it there at the bottom of the screen, washingtonpost.com/live. Once again, I'm Jonathan Capehart. Thanks for watching Washington Post Live.